Right, so on paper, Your Name and Yumi and the Nightmare Painter are basically the same story. They're both body-switching romances between a city boy and a shrine maiden, and they both do the same big plot twist where we find out the girl has actually been dead the whole story and they can't be together. Now, the settings are slightly different. One has these really beautiful depictions of a serene Japanese life, while the other has the blood of a dead god congealing into living nightmares that feed off the fears of children. Basically the same thing. But I don't think that actually differentiates the story that much. I think the real difference in tone between the two actually comes from the big twist playing a different role in the stories. We get the same key events in both. They start switching bodies, that builds into a romance. Eventually the switching stops, and they have to investigate what was happening. That's where we learn the girl died in a big crisis that happened years ago. And then there's a big action scene where we save everyone. There's then a weird fake-out ending in both the stories where you think they're still not going to get together, but it does resolve in a happy ending where the couple's reunited at the end. Where the stories are different is when all these events take place. In Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, they're all jumbled up near the end, while in Your Name, they're spread out throughout the whole story. This difference in pacing has a big effect on all aspects of the stories, from the nature of the conflict, to the character dynamics, to the tone throughout. So let's dig into what I mean by that by taking a closer look at both stories. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter's main characters are, believe it or not, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. Yumi is a young girl that lives in a world with extreme sunlight. The ground is superheated, so buildings have to kind of levitate above it. And in order to do that, they have to make art in order to impress spirits and get them to do things for them. Yumi is one of the only people in the world that can do this, and thus has a huge amount of pressure on her all the time. Because there's a lot of specific rituals involved, her life also ends up being extremely sheltered. She basically isn't allowed to do anything by herself. She can't choose to go anywhere they don't tell her to. She can't bathe herself. She can't even eat food by herself. They have to do this whole ritual where they choose what food to give her, and she just opens her mouth and they feed her like a baby. And she's also unwilling to question any of this because it's been strongly impressed on her the importance of this role and how essential she is. Our other character, Painter, has a totally opposite life. He lives in this world constantly cloaked in a impermeable darkness. There are these crazy monsters living within that darkness that come out to attack people, but the so-called nightmare painters create art which wards them off. Our main character, Nikaro, is one of these painters who goes by his job title instead of his name in kind of a misguided way to make himself feel important. He likes imagining he's this lone hero out protecting the city from this evil threat, but reality is a lot more mundane, and he isn't doing anything all that heroic. The imbalance between his grand ideals and his more simple reality has gotten him pretty jaded in life. He's really given up on having friends and spurned people around him, and doesn't really care about art that he's making anymore, just kind of treating it as a utilitarian thing he does to make money. After our introduction to these characters, both of them get a problem that they need to solve. Yumi meets a spirit that kind of mysteriously talks about being in great danger, and Painter discovers a stable nightmare that threatens to break into the city and start killing people. But before either of them can solve these problems, they collapse, and we start the whole body-switching thing. Painter wakes up in Yumi's world of brightness, and Yumi wakes up in Painter's world of darkness. Now, in order to solve their problems, they have to teach each other how to do their jobs. Painter has to teach Yumi how to exorcise nightmares, and Yumi has to teach Painter how to interact with the spirits. In learning each other's jobs, they also have to learn about each other as people, and this inspires growth for each of them. Yumi helps get Painter to rediscover his love for art and start trusting people in his life again. Where Painter comes into Yumi's life and starts questioning everything and makes her break out of her shell and be a lot more assertive. This takes up the bulk of the story, but in the background there's also an investigation into why they're switching bodies in the first place. There's a lot of fun lore and theories that they have, Painter, for a while, thinks Yumi's an alien, which is kind of ridiculous, except by the end of the story, you find out both his goth friend and the hot waitress are both aliens. Okay, well, technically the hot waitress is a sword, so I don't know if that counts. Or can she be a sword? Because is she like Ox, where she can't do that? Or, okay, never mind. The point is, by the end of the story, we still don't really know what's going on with that. Everything starts coming towards a head, where Painter and Yumi have acknowledged that they have romantic feelings for each other, and they've both gotten pretty good at the other person's job. This is when the stable nightmare suddenly appears, and they have to confront it, and Painter finally makes contact with the spirits that were talking to Yumi at the beginning of the story. But just as we're hitting the climax of both the interpersonal and external conflicts, the bond between the two is suddenly severed and they return to their own original bodies. They frantically try to search for answers and eventually discover that their two conflicts were really the same thing. Thousands of years ago, there was a big calamity that killed everyone in the world Yumi lived in and created the nightmares and darkness in Painter's world. Yumi died in that event, and her spirit has been trapped for thousands of years. So saving the spirits and stopping the nightmares is really the same thing. Just as we thought we had resolved the conflict, we get this huge escalation. And now the conflict's about saving the entire world and not just their two individual problems. They each independently form a plan to fight against this, which they're only able to do thanks to the growth they inspired each other throughout the whole story. We get a big action scene for both of them, and they ultimately win, but are unable to be reunited. The witty narrator has a whole speech about how not every story has a happy ending, but Yumi's like basically a god, so she just kind of shows up and's like, hey, I'd kind of like to not be dead. And Painter's like, that sounds good. And we get a happy ending at the end regardless. Now, switching over to Your Name, we see the intro's a lot more mundane. Our characters are Mitsuha, a girl living in a shrine in a small Japanese town, and Taki, a guy living in Tokyo. Neither have very strong personal conflicts. Mitsuha is sick of living in a small town, and Taki is too embarrassed to ask a coworker out on a date, but neither have the big fatal flaws we see in Yumi and Painter. As we start the body-switching plot, because neither has the big flaws, there's a lot more focus on just getting used to the new situation than there is trying to solve anything. This lack of conflict leads to the story needing to keep the audience's attention in different ways. The body switching isn't spelled out in the same way, so the audience is kind of kept on their toes trying to figure out what's going on in the beginning. They use the amazing visuals and soundtrack to keep you interested, and there's a lot more comedy in the interactions between the two in the switched bodies. Some of which is pretty culturally specific to Japanese. Now, just as we're starting to build this into a romance story, the switching stops. And that's where we get the actual conflict of the story, trying to reunite Taki and Mitsuha. We switch to just following Taki as he tries to track down the small town Mitsuha lived in, road tripping around Japan to find the place he saw through her eyes. He eventually finds the town only to discover it was destroyed by a meteor 3 years ago. He and Mitsuha were connected through time and stopped switching when the meteor hit and killed Mitsuha. Taki then does some drugs, which lets him reestablish the link between them, and he explains the whole situation to her. Together they try to come up with a plan and split up to have a big action scene where they try to save the town from the meteor. Because of the growth they inspired in each other, the plan works and the town is saved. Their magical connection is still broken, however, so they stay separated. The story winds down by skipping 3 years into the future, and we have Taki monologuing about how he's still searching for that connection that he never really found again. And it seems like we're going to end on a bittersweet note, but then they have a chance encounter and are happily reunited for the end of the story. Comparing the two stories, I think the most obvious difference between them is how the conflict is used. Yumi fits the classic 3-act structure really well. Act 1 is the introduction. We set up the characters and world of the story and get a conflict they're trying to solve. In this case, we have both internal conflict and external threats. Act 2 is rising action. The conflict gradually gets more intense and we see our characters grow to rise to the occasion. The big twist, where the characters are separated and we learn the true nature of the world and their connection, serves as a rapid escalation of that same conflict to make the final climax extremely tense and exciting. Act 3 is the resolution, where we defeat our problems and our characters get a happy ending. Your Name, on the other hand, doesn't really fit the 3-act structure at all. The major conflict is the characters trying to reunite with each other, but they aren't separated until halfway through the story. They both have some character growth, but it doesn't really build and compound throughout the story the same way. Instead of the big twist working to escalate the conflict and make an exciting climax, the twist is the conflict, and the characters spend most of the story responding to it. What Your Name instead fits really well is a 4-act structure, something common in Asian storytelling, but pretty rare in the West. In Japanese, they call it Ki, Sho, Ten, Ketsu. The first 2 acts are essentially unchanged. Ki means introduction, where we set up the characters and setting. Sho means development, where things get more complicated, just like the rising action. But where in the 3-act structure, this development goes throughout the story, here we have ten, or twist. A good 3rd-act twist doesn't just escalate the conflict we've seen so far. It adds an entire new dimension to the story. It totally changes how you view the beginning of the story and can make you completely reevaluate where you think this is all going. The 4th act is then Ketsu, resolution. While I view the resolution of a 3-act structure as kind of tying up loose ends, here it's more, how will our characters respond to this new post-plot twist world? And this fits Your Name really well. We get an introduction to the characters, followed by the body switching gradually playing out. Then, around halfway through, we get the big twist, the switching stopping, and the gradual reveal of the meteor that killed Mitsuha. This is a totally new conflict than the light mystery we had in the beginning, and totally changes your perspective on some earlier scenes. We then still have a 4th of the story to see how our characters will respond to this information. In this case, re-establishing the connection and executing a plan to save the townspeople from the meteor. Both of these approaches have their advantages. In Yumi's 3-act structure, the twist acts as a climax to a conflict that is built throughout the whole story. This gives more room for character development and relationships to build more gradually throughout. In my opinion, this is what makes Yumi and Painter's relationship feel way more organic than Taki and Mitsuha's. The slower build-up also gives more room for hinting at the twist before it occurs. This is especially useful for an author like Sanderson, who can put the story within his large universe and give clues towards the twist that you can only pick up by thinking deeply about the shared rules between his books. The added time before the twist also lets the author make it more complicated, in a more time to set up dominoes equals a more spectacular fall kind of way. In comparison, the twist in Your Name's 4-act structure is much more central to the story. Having half the story after the twist means we have to sit and struggle with it much more. The story is much more about the feeling of having lost Mitsuha than it is about the feeling of falling in love with her in the beginning. Putting the twist in the middle allows your characters to feel actual loss while not being forced to end the story that way. The 4-act structure can also make the story feel less predictable. There's less time before the twist to make predictions, and because you have to reevaluate everything after, the ending can be much more unexpected. Most people I've watched the movie with expect it to end multiple times, which allows it to keep surprising them. This also means the surprise fake-out ending is a lot more believable, as we don't have the entire plot building towards a happy ending. Now, I think it's worth noting here that I'm specifically highlighting how the twist nature of the 4-act structure feels different than the 3-act structure, which isn't necessarily how everyone uses Ki, Sho, Ten, Ketsu. If you think of 10 as climax, you can kind of break down any story into either a 3 or 4-act structure. Case in point, the Your Name comic is split into 3 volumes, while Yumi is split into 4 parts. I think breaking them down the way I did is a lot more natural and helps explain how the story works. But just like with every model, there is no one way you have to use these structures, and you can really do anything with them as long as it seems helpful for you. Like, for me, this view of a twist-centered 4-act structure is super helpful to explain a lot of big shifts that happen in Japanese stories. There are tons of examples in manga and anime of dramatic changes to the conflict or character dynamics that happen around the halfway mark, and looking at these through the lens of a 4-act structure can help give you a bigger appreciation for how they work. Here's another thing this can help explain. Remember how they had Attack on Titan, the final season, and then that season ended on a cliffhanger, and 9 months later they came out with the final season part 2, And then that also ended on a cliffhanger. And 11 months later, they came out with the final season, the final chapters, which also didn't end. And we had to wait another 8 months for the final season, the final chapter, part 2. What was up with all that? Why not just have a season 5? Well, if you look at the whole show together, it's pretty obvious they're not talking about season in the sense of season of time. Every season had big gaps between them, but also multiple seasons have these big gaps in the middle of them. And they're not grouping them into seasons on the basis of combined runtime, because each season has a pretty different value for that. Instead, I think they want to keep it to 4 seasons because each season maps really well onto the 4-act structure. Season 1, we get an intro to the world and characters, and Season 2, all of that gets a lot more complicated. Then, Season 3, we get this huge shift in how we see the world and the characters. And Season 4 is the resolution of that. How do all of our characters react to that big twist we got in Season 3? Attack on Titan is also a good example of how the role of a twist can change when used within larger stories. Stories can be fractal, so you can get nested 4-act structures within the larger structure of the story. In Attack on Titan, Season 2 acts as the development for the full story, but it has its own 4-act structure. Episode 1 is our intro. There's new titans in the wall, and we have the appearance of the mysterious Beast Titan. In episodes 2 through 5, we develop on that. We get some tense action scenes and hints that makes us start questioning the larger plot. Episode 6, Warrior, is our twist. It comes out of nowhere and totally recontextualizes the story thus far. Then we spend the rest of the season responding to the situation that the twist put us in. So in the context of Season 2, Warrior functions as the Act 3 twist. But within the larger series, it's part of Act 2, working to further develop the conflict. We can even go a layer deeper than that, and look at a 4-act structure that's just within that one episode. The episode starts with a recap of the season so far, and the intro, which sets the mood for things to come. Then we spend about a third of the episode talking through the things we've discovered. The characters combine their information and are realizing that things are more complicated than they thought. At almost exactly the halfway mark in the episode, we get probably the most iconic twist setup I've ever seen, and then we spend around 4 minutes giving a flashback for context of that twist, and then we finish with another 4 minutes of everyone's response now that the twist is out in the open. Now, to contrast Attack on Titan, let's have a look at how Sanderson uses twists in his larger series. The Stormlight Archive is a good example of a third type of twist that's kind of a blend of what we've talked about so far, the twist ending. Twist endings are similar to 3-act structure twists in that they come at the end of a story and often escalate the conflict. But when you have a sequel to a story that ends with a twist ending, it's similar to a 4-act structure, where we get to see all the ramifications of that twist going forward. Each of the 4 Stormlight books we have so far ends with a twist like this, and a lot of them are vaguely similar to the twists we see in Attack on Titan. Both stories have twists that recontextualize the moral high ground, and big lore dumps that explain a lot of the conflict we've seen so far. The big difference in my mind is while the twists in Stormlight Archives make the story a lot more nuanced and interesting, they don't change the nature of the conflict in the same way. The story isn't built around these twists, so they end up changing a lot less. What's up with the Titans is a way more central question than anything we can ask about the nature of Parshmen or Shard Blades or Radiance. This makes Stormlight twists feel less crazy and impactful, but it also helps the story be a lot more congruent than Attack on Titan. If you like Way of Kings, you're probably going to like the whole series. But just because you like Attack on Titan Season 1, you might not like Attack on Titan Season 4. A scene like this from Season 1 has a very different type of appeal than a scene like this from Season 4.
So, did he say anything before he was killed? He asked why I wasn't willing to talk to him. I think That question still applies. We haven't been willing to talk. We all just started fighting and assumed it had to be to the death.
So there you go. Using twists near the end to escalate a conflict versus twists in the middle to change the nature of the conflict. Thanks for watching, and I hope you found this interesting. My unsolicited story recommendation of the day is Shin Sekai Yori, or From the New World. It's one of my favorite examples of a story taking a magic system and really looking hard at the ramifications that would have for the society the characters live in. It's also an interesting example of how stories pace twists, some in ways I like and some in ways I don't. So check it out if that sounds interesting. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.